COBIT standards. All right. Everybody got the slide showed up?
Yes.
All right. So I was assigned COBIT standards, or I picked it, I guess. Um, so what exactly is COBIT? It stands for Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. That's just a whole lot of words to simply mean it's basically focused on anything IT related. So it's very broad base of standards. So it's not a singular focus, but overall IT focused. It was created by ISACA, Information Systems Audit and Control Association for IT governance and management, designed to be a supportive tool for managers. So this is really one of the key differences you'll see about COBIT against other standards is the focus is mainly for the managers, and also when it comes to being COBIT certified or going through the training and classes, these are the people that are most likely going to be getting this training. It's not for everybody in your business or organization, but it can be for a lot of people. Um, and it allows bridging the crucial gap between technical issues, business risk, and control requirements. All that basically means is this group of standards in its broad-based application is meant to handle basically any kind of IT issue you might have. So it could be based on security, it could be based simply on not having enough people to work, how you issue work, how you spend your money. It's very broad-based in its application. So COBIT components, it's got a few main components to it. This is mainly based on COBIT 4.0. I'll show you 5.0 here in a second. So they're very similar, 4.0 and 5.0. They have a framework. So basically, IT helps in organizing the objectives of IT governance and bringing in the best practices in IT processes and domains while linking business requirements. That's a whole lot of verbiage. Basically, as you can see, IT governance, so how you handle your IT people, how you handle your systems, that might include some basic security, but it doesn't necessarily just have to be about security. It could be for procurement, how you handle your procurement process. It also can be how you choose your partners, so linking business requirements. COBIT is very much used in partnerships and things like that. Many partners won't happen. Business partnerships won't happen if only one meets the COBIT standards. So then you have process descriptions. It is a reference model and also acts as a common language for every individual in the organization. The process descriptions include planning, building, running, and monitoring of all IT processes. So this kind of boils down to the main focus of COBIT. And one of the main strengths is, so your managers are mainly going to be the people who have the training to implement COBIT, but what you can do is have them distill that information down to the people that need only certain parts of it. So your cybersecurity response team might only need to know some certain things to kind of implement COBIT, while your manager, who might need to be able to linking all those different teams together, needs to know the whole process. So then you got control objectives. This provides a complete list of requirements that have been considered by the management for effective IT business control. These are things that your management team are going to have to implement. COBIT kind of gives direction on some of these things. There are some hard layouts, but for the most part, it kind of gives you a fair amount of mobility in choosing how you implement COBIT. It's more about providing that framework. So your control objectives might be, you know, 3 people must sign off on a procurement or something like that. You got maturity models, access the maturity and the capability of every process while addressing the gaps. This is going to be very heavily into your procurement and also your employees. If you tend to be an organization that has a lot of more turns the older employees that are going to be retiring, you need to have a nice um, tunnel of employees going up through the process so you can maintain that high level of skill when your current set decides to retire. And then you got management guidelines, helps in better assigning responsibilities, measuring performance, agreeing on common objectives, and illustrating better interrelationships with every other process. All these long verbiages were taken from ISACA just to get you the idea of how COBIT works. So just in their general language of how they describe how it works, you can kind of see it's very broad based.
Mhm.
So the management guidelines is very similar. As you can see, COBIT relies heavily on your management. So it helps in better assigning responsibilities. Your managers need to be able to take on responsibilities, but also pass it off correctly. But as we see in COBIT 5.0, this can be kind of a problem. So your COBIT framework, as discussed earlier back here, just at the top there, it really gets a further breakdown into planning and organization, delivering and support, acquiring and implementation, monitoring and evaluating. So as you can see with the COBIT, it's the full life process of not just your business, but your products and also the products you use. So if you got old software, you need to plan for retiring that software or acquiring new one. And you can kind of see it just in the framework here how they line these things out. You get your planning and organization phase, that's going to be your start. And then as you're delivering products or using products, you need to also be able to have the support there for them. And then acquiring implementation and monitoring, evaluating, those are more towards the end. So acquiring implementation, that's definitely going to be for you buying things as opposed to providing products. And monitoring, evaluating, that's for both the products you provide as well as the ones you're buying. You need to make sure that your current systems are up to date and whatnot, as well as your products that you're providing are getting the support they need and are being evaluated for future generations. So COBIT 5.0 really solved the hot potato problem. So as we go back down here, management guidelines, you can kind of see it's basically built into this process that the best managing is to constantly pass down whatever the problem is to somebody that can better solve it. The problem is then you'll get an environment where all the stakeholders try to pass down tasks down the line and nothing really gets done. Or the people that end up doing the product might not be the best ones suited for it. They just might be the lower person on the totem pole. So five COBIT 5.0 provided a different focus, and the 5.0 is the main one used today. So it's meeting the needs of the stakeholders, covering the whole enterprise from end to end. And that part is really important because now your managers have to also determine when the work must stop. Like you can't pass it on any further. And when to do this is preferably, higher up the chain as opposed to down the chain, because then you're getting your work done faster. Application of a single integrated framework. This is really trying to bring in COBIT used across not just your business, but across a lot of businesses. And you'll see as I talk later on, COBIT is fairly used, even though this is the first time I've ever really heard about it. It's a fairly used process. Ensuring a holistic approach to the business decision making. So this is really coming back to the meeting the needs of all stakeholders and separating the governance from the management. You need to have a certain separation just so you can implement the process better with less interference. So overall, COBIT is more focused on the way tasks and processes should be done over the entire IT stack, including procurement, implementation, and follow-on tasks such as maintenance. So you can see this isn't just about like coding standards or something like that, or you need to have certain things in place for security. This is really about the whole thing, and that's why it's so kind of generalized. These standards are important to know, especially in management roles, because essentially every large business practices them. And this is pretty much true. You'll see with a lot of large businesses, I'm not talking about small or medium, I'm talking about simply large businesses. You'll see that these standards, pretty much everybody practices it because it helps them do those partnerships. Having a COBIT standard in place and saying if you are meeting the standards, you're more easily likely to get those partnerships, along with, say, you're trying to make bids for certain products. So use case, one of the largest use case of COBIT is to pass the standard itself, as I was saying, and show compliance. Certain corporations, in order for them to become a partner, must show compliance beforehand. Think of this as another overview of the company similar to looking over financials. So like if you're going to make a group decision with another company, you want to make sure that they can work together with your company, but also work in a similar way that you find to be effective. And if they're meeting the COBIT standard like you, then you can assume that. In order to be able to bid on a contract, a corporation may be required to show compliance. That's coming back to the other part. You know, just having the compliance in place and showing you are compliant will open up a lot more doors. And it's also assumed that by following COBIT, your business will work a lot better. Quickly finding IT problems. For modern IT companies, it can be difficult to recognize where the bottlenecks may be. COBIT focuses on giving management the tools needed to not only find these bottlenecks, but also find the solutions. One of the biggest use cases I saw for this was a certain IT company was providing a certain product, but the problem was their IT personnel themselves preferred to do maintenance of the service as opposed to maintenance on the product. By using the COBIT, the management was quickly able to find this bottleneck problem of basically too many people who wanted to do one task and not the more important task, and then find the solution of, well, we'll just simply redirect more resources to where it's needed and cut back on the server tasks that aren't necessarily as needed. Lessons learned. COBIT is an overall framework to approach IT, and that's really the key here. I mean, you could see COBIT used in many different kind of businesses, but any business that is more IT reliant, or their products are more IT focused, you'll really see COBIT used more often. It is used wisely, especially by management. This comes back to one of the other frameworks of COBIT is not everybody necessarily in your team needs to be trained. You just need to have a certain enough personnel using COBIT and implementing it to be effective, and that's best by management. And showing compliance can be used as a way to predetermine partnerships and approval for jobs. I talked about that in some of the use cases, and that's one of the more important parts of COBIT, not just in improving your business, but also making it easier for you to have those open doors with new businesses. Any questions?
So are there some any like certifications that organization achieve when they follow certain standards that are required by COBIT? So is there something like that in this framework?
Uh, Through Asaka, you can go through the training, yes. But as far as like a rubber stamp approval, I don't really think so, as far as I could see. But the Osaka website has been rather slow these last couple of days. I don't know if that's due to this COVID-19 or not.
Okay, and is it primarily used by like private organizations or even in the government sector they try to follow some of these standards?
It all depends on what the organization is trying to accomplish. So you could see this in private and government, yes.
Okay, any other questions from anyone? If not, then we'll move to Chris.
Sounds good. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Sorry, let me share my screen. Can you guys still see my screen, or is it showing like the like presenter view?
Yes,
I can see the notes. It's not the,
it's not the presenter view.
yeah.
There's that.
Yeah, now it's better.
Okay, cool. All right. So I had HIPAA standards. So what is HIPAA? It's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1966. It establishes guidelines for a national standard of electronic healthcare transaction and code sets, unique health identifiers, and security, protects individuals' medical records and other personal health information, requires appropriate safeguards to protect the privacy of health information, and then it also set limits on uses and disclosures without patient authorization. So kind of what that is was just a lot of words to say. It really mostly pertains to like patient information, patient medical records, and then also what companies are kind of able to do with that. For the most part, HIPAA is broken up into 5 different titles that covers, sorry, this is not on the slide, but it covers health insurance for job changes. So if you lose your job or if you just have a gap in unemployment or gap in employment, national standards for electronic transactions, guidelines for pre-tax spending accounts, group health plans, and the 5th is company-owned life insurance policies. So I focus mostly during this presentation on the like electronic transactions, stuff that relates specifically to like data, patient records, information, because I felt like that was the only part really that was super relevant to kind of what we've learned. So why is HIPAA important? Like I said, it protects patient information from being spread or shared without patient consent, and this applies to like marketing and research and kind of all different aspects of what a patient's, I guess, records would be used for. Applies to healthcare providers, health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and then business associates. So really anybody who would come in, any kind of business entity that would come in contact with this like a patient's information. Increases accountability for employees between jobs. Like I mentioned earlier, covering like health insurance between jobs, and then encourages the computerization of patient medical records, which is again kind of like a lot of what I focused on here. So the history of HIPAA. In 1966, it was the first bill was passed that increases the portability and accountability of health insurance coverage to combat waste, fraud, and abuse in health insurance, and to promote the use of medical savings account with tax breaks. And then within, so like I mentioned, a lot of what I wanted to focus on was kind of data, customer information, customer records, or on patient records. There have been 5 big rules that had a significant impact on that. So for the next few slides, it's focusing just on those 5 rules. The first of which was in 2003, the privacy rule was created, which defines protected health information, PHI, introduced instructions for how PHI should be disclosed and how permission should be obtained. In 2005, the security rule came into force, which deals specifically with electronically stored PHI, which is ePHI. And there's a little bit more about that on this slide. The security rule itself defines 3 goals. Administrative, which just kind of talks about how all business entities, kind of the rules standard they have to follow. Physical, relating to, of course, like physical access of data storage, and then technical, just exactly what it sounds like, everything relating to ePHI, which is, again, electronic patient health information. In 2009, the breach notification rule was enacted that requires HIPAA-covered entities to notify patients of a breach in their information. And I touch a little bit more on that in a few slides. And then also in 2009, the enforcement rule was introduced that contains rules on compliance hearings, penalties, and investigations for violations. So it kind of goes hand in hand with the breach notification rule. And then the final slide about HIPAA history. In 2013, the omnibus final rule was defined, and it sort of modified all 4 rules because a lot of them, I think the earliest one had been introduced a decade earlier. The act itself was in the 90s, so the omnibus final rule kind of modified all 4 rules, which is again privacy, security, breach notification, and enforcement. It did a lot like strengthening limitations on use and disclosure of health information, prohibited the sale of public information without individual authorization, expanded an individual's rights to receive electronic copies of their health information, and then also kind of increased and also helped kind of define the penalties and the penalty structure for the enforcement rule. And one of the requirements was kind of have a checklist to see how well a company is kind of following HIPAA standards, the guidelines. So I found a few different resources, and then I kind of condensed them into what I thought were the 6 most important sort of different bullet points. So there are technical, physical, and administrative protections, and then the 3 rules that I thought were most relevant to see kind of how a company is kind of responding to different changes were the privacy, breach notification, and the omnibus rule. So first is technical protections, which kind of sound, it's a lot of the standards, a lot of what companies are supposed to do is pretty standard in a lot of companies, but then also standard in like a lot of stuff we saw in like just different trainings and stuff we've done throughout the semester, such as encrypting all electronic information, controlling access, controlling and monitor activity audits. Again, kind of same thing, like I mentioned, stuff we've kind of trained to work on. If you see like 1,000 failed login attempts in 30 minutes on a machine that has customer information, it's probably something suspicious going on. And then again, stuff just like automatic log off, password requirements, making sure people aren't just like leaving their laptop unlocked for overnight, stuff like that. So like pretty basic stuff to make sure companies are following these different requirements. There are also physical protections, controlling building data access. Again, a lot of this stuff is stuff that most companies follow outside of the healthcare industry, but it's still outlined, still important to make sure, I guess, that they're following it. Controlling building data access, managing and monitoring workstations, mobile device policy. Again, I think almost every company that deals with sensitive data has some kind of mobile device policy. Logging and tracking servers. And then also administrative protections, assessing risk to determine the level of threat. So if you have like a breach of information that's maybe, like a cyber attack where they steal 500,000 patients' data, is obviously going to be a different level of threat than if somebody like leaves their laptop open at home and their kid gets on the laptop and accidentally sees like a file they're not supposed to see. So assessing and determining the level of threat, training staff on access protocols and to respond to breaches, which I touch a little bit more on in just a second with the breach notification rule. Forming and testing contingency plans for all kind of disasters. So something, like I said, like I mentioned, like a serious cyber attack or something a lot less severe, almost like an accidental breach of one of these rules, or like a server room flooding. So kind of preparing for all different kinds of situations and then documenting all security incidents. The privacy rules, so this is the first of kind of the 3 rules that I thought were most important to see how a company is kind of handling the different HIPAA requirements. Responding promptly. So the privacy rule gives 30 days to respond to patient requests, and that's kind of requests for their own medical information. Training staff to know what is and is not covered. So like I mentioned, stuff like if someone calls in and they want to get information about like a family member, what is and is not allowed to be shared. Obtaining permission from patients for research, fundraising, marketing. So something I was reading about was saying that like follow-up survey results used to be used widely up until the privacy rule was introduced, and then you have to get follow-up survey results for like heart attack patients was the specific example I was reading about. Being able to use that like survey information later on down the road used to be a lot easier until the privacy rule was introduced, and now you'd have to go back and obtain permission from all of the people who filled out a survey. So just kind of, I guess, complicating things a lot more specifically for research. And then updating forms so patient understands their rights, allowances, and permissions. The breach notification rule says that if any breach occurs, both the patients and the HHS department, which is Health and Human Services Department, must be notified. If over 500 people are affected, the media must also be notified. And then all notifications must be completed within 60 days post-discovery. So one of the breaches that I was reading about took place last year, 2019. And it was a few different, I think it was 6 different companies that reported losing customer information because of one attack that took place over the course of 8 months. So I just thought it was interesting that even though the attack lasted almost a year, the company still has 60 days from when they discovered the attack or whatever breach it is. And then making sure each notification consists of 4 things, and that is a description of what was breached, who accessed the information, whether the information was taken or just simply seen, and then the degree to which the risk was successfully mitigated. And then the final rule was the omnibus rule, which requires you have to update the business associate agreement, the BAA, to reflect the requirements, refresh the privacy policy, because like I mentioned, it was something that was introduced after all of the other rules, so it did affect all of the rules. So kind of making sure you're updating that patients, customers understand what their rules, requirements, and I guess rights are. And then refresh training to make sure anyone who interacts with data or information is aware of all rule adjustments. Especially, I think this one was a lot more relevant around the time a lot of things were being transitioned from analog to digital, excuse me. Making sure that people understand, anyone who's using the information understands kind of the changes that are coming along with that. And then the lessons learned, just as I was doing the research about HIPAA, there are a million rules and regulations for every aspect of medical records. As a patient, all of my information, I said is protected and safe from theft, but it should be protected and safe from theft. There are a lot of rules and regulations about kind of what is allowed to be shared. Doesn't always mean people are following them, but for the most part, my information should be safe. As a business, no details can be glossed over and every contingency must be accounted for. Like I said, stuff like, again, like cyber attacks, like targeted attacks, or just accidental breaches of information, or a tornado coming through and wiping out a server center somewhere. The way information is used and understood is constantly changing, and we all must be able to adapt, especially with a lot of the transition from physical to online storage. Are there any questions?
Yeah, so are there any instances that you know where a certain company maybe violated some of these standards and was like it faced some sanctions or fines?
No, I mentioned I done some research about companies who did have different. It was the American. I don't remember what the full title was, but the American like Center for Medical something along those lines was a company that oversaw or worked with 6 different business entities, and all within 2019, all 6 of those had reported a total of like I think it was 25 million patient like medical records had been breached over the course of 8 months. So I'm not sure what I didn't read about like the punishment or kind of what they had to do, but I thought it was interesting that they were still at the time that report was written, the one that I was reading, they were still kind of receiving updates about companies finding out more and more of their customers' data had been breached.
Do you think they would have received some different outcome had they followed some of these standards strictly?
Yeah, I wasn't able to really understand what the actual breach, like where it came from, but I'm sure it was, if they had kind of followed the requirements more closely, I'm sure it would have been harder to have that actual breach. Like I mentioned right here, like there are a lot of different requirements and rules, so I'm sure it is, I guess, tricky, but I did see a lot of different like online training for like HIPAA, no like official certification, but a lot of different training courses just to make sure people are kind of understanding what those rules and regulations they should be following are.
Okay. Any more questions? If not, then we'll move to Dan. Are you ready, Dan? Okay.
Hold on, give me a second.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. All right, so My topic was on the National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-82. So before I kind of go into that, I'm going to talk about what it focuses on. So the two areas of focus are ICS and SCADA. ICS is an industrial control system. It's a general term. It includes several types of control systems. The systems are used for the industrial process, and a SCADA system is a supervisory control and data acquisition system, which is another type of control system. It allows remote access to local control. And the architecture usually includes computers, graphical user interfaces, PLCs, PIDs, and networked data communication. This also includes distributed control systems, which are called DCS. So ICS versus SCADA. So there's something called operational technology, and that's going to be the outer circle. That includes everything. It's going to include the industrial control system. And inside of the industrial control system, you have SCADA systems. So ICS are usually used in like industries such as electric, water, wastewater, oil, natural gas, transportation, pharmaceutical, paper, food, beverage, and discrete manufacturing. SCADA systems are generally used for like dispersed assets, centralized in data acquisition. And DCS systems are usually used to control like production systems within a local area. So applications, you have water distribution, sewage, oil and natural gas, traffic systems, power plants, transportation systems like the light rail, and then manufacturing and distribution. So anything basically industrial process. So the importance, it's vital to the operation of critical infrastructures in the US. These infrastructures are highly interconnected, but they're also independent. 90% of these infrastructures are privately owned and operated. Many of them are also owned by federal agencies that work in combination with some of the private owned operations. So this is the standard itself. Some of the consequences before I go into like what the standard is looking for is if we don't follow these standards. So we would have physical impacts, which could be like damage to the environment, obviously loss of life, loss of property. So like if a building explodes or if some sort of water reserve or something that's doing anything with sewage gets damaged, usually leads to more issues. The economic impacts, you know, if you can't have electricity, water, or transportation, that's obviously going to be a problem. There's economic loss. A lot of times, if something like this were to go down, there would be a lot of business loss, and it could even affect things on a global standard. Social impacts, as always with cyber attacks, is, you know, you lose confidence in an organization. It's usually a bad thing if it's especially government related. Then you have impacts on national security. Hazardous materials can leak into water, lead to product contamination, stuff like that. So the goals of this publication are how to secure ICS and SCADA systems and other control systems like DCS. It addresses like reliability, safety requirements, and kind of breaks down what each of these systems do and their unique performances. It gives you ways to identify threats and vulnerabilities, and also what measures you would need to take to mitigate associated risks. So the objectives, you would restrict logical access to the ICS network. So you could use unidirectional gateways. You would have like a DMZ with a firewall, separate networks for the ICs and for corporate and the ICS network, multiple layer networks. Obviously restricting physical access to the ICS network and its devices. So they would have like card readers, some sort of access control, guards, protecting individual ICS components. So security patches, disabled unused ports, restricting user privileges, antiviruses. Then you would also want to restrict unauthorized modification of data as always. So protect network boundaries, protect the data when it's in transit as well. Detecting security events. So you would want to be able to detect when a component has failed, not just if something's been, compromised. So that would be like maybe if a service is unavailable, or if whatever station you're working at, if all the resources are being exhausted, that might lead to some sort of issue with the actual system itself. You would want to maintain functionality during adverse conditions. So for that, you would have redundancy. So if one component fails, you would have another setup that could take its place without any kind of freeze or issue with the services that are being provided. You don't want to have cascading events. So if a component does fail, you don't want it to cause a problem elsewhere and just keep moving down the line. Then you would also like graceful degradation. So basically, you don't go from normal operation to instant emergency operation. The system can gracefully move across the different operations and get into that the emergency point. So it doesn't just shut off immediately. And then also restoring the system after an incident is really big. So being able to quickly respond and also have a plan to recover. So one of the areas that the publication focuses on is the risk management and assessment. So since these types of industries are using hazardous materials, or even there's people involved in these situations, their biggest thing is going to be safety and engineering in mind. So they want these industries to focus on risk management process with the 4 components. So you would have framing. So you'd want to develop a framework for decisions to be made. And then safety would be the next one, and availability and recovery. Assessing. So assess the situation, assess the impacts of what kind of damage you're looking at and what your vulnerabilities and threats are going to be. Then you're going to respond. So you're going to have an organizational response and an action against risk. So what are the most important risks that you want to avoid? And then monitoring the system where it's ongoing. So you're going to be consistently watching the system. It's not just hey, we'll peek in once a month, or we'll hire a red team to go through our system once and then we're good. It's ongoing. So some examples would be Slammer, which was a SQL worm that infected an idle computer at the Davis-Besse nuclear power plant back in 2003. The Stuxnet worm, which is most people should be pretty familiar with, is the highly specialized malware that was aimed at Iran's nuclear facilities, and it was actually like pretty advanced, and it was able to only target specific SCADA systems. And then there's the German steel mill, which they were able to manipulate the control systems, and they weren't able to accurately or safely shut down the blast furnace, which caused massive damage to their steel mill plant. So this is the checklist from the special publication. They actually recommend to not use this as a checklist, but more as an assessment. They say that every single decision that is made to meet security needs is going to vary based on the company and what they're trying to protect. But these are the main areas that they outlined. So you have your risk assessment and framework. So that's your planning, policy, procedures. Your access control, which these would be different things that can kind of help with access control. So you'd have like role-based, web server security. A lot of web servers are actually not recommended just due to the probability of there being bugs. Virtual LAN, dial-up modems, how things interact with the wireless networks. They want awareness and training. So every single thing that they go over needs to be relayed onto almost every single employee, and that way they understand what's going on and what's expected of them. Audit and accountability. So even though you have these standards set in place, you need to consistently be reviewing them and making sure that if the people aren't following them, they're being reprimanded. Security assessment and authorization. So you'll have certification for certain security controls to let them know, and also upper management know, like, hey, these people know what they're doing. So it's okay that they're working on these systems. Configuration management, modifications to hardware, software, and documents needs to be documented, and it needs to be accessible for employees. Contingency planning. So in case something does happen, how do you continue the business and what's your recovery plan? Identification, authentication. Some of the ways they recommend doing this is password authentication by using like a challenge or a response, or even giving like a password error if it doesn't meet a certain criteria. Physical token, smart card, biometric scanners, all that stuff. Incident response is obviously part of it. Maintenance, so you would have routine and preventative procedures. Then you have media protection, so you need to limit access to certain media sections and devices. So not everybody should be able to just walk up and plug something into a system. Then you have physical and environment protection. So protect from like power outages, filled components, environmental control. Cabling is a big one. They want to decide, hey, are we going to be using fiber optic? Are we going to be using coaxial? How are these cables protected, encased? Can someone just go and gain access to these cables? That's a really big component of that. And then planning, specify requirements and just make sure you meet them. Personal security, you want to reduce the risk of theft, fraud, or human error, which human error is definitely bound to happen. You want to assess the risks, system and services acquisitions. That was kind of leaned more towards if you're bringing in another team, or if you're bringing in some new service, how is it going to mesh with your services, and are you even able to do that? Because a lot of times these systems are using third-party companies, and if you were to do like an update or deploy some sort of software that isn't approved by them, they will drop you completely and won't offer you any support. So system and communication protection, so encryption, VPN. You want to keep the system and information integrity, so avoid malicious code. You would want to have antiviruses. Firewalls is a really big thing. They have like, I want to say about 15 pages, I think, or 20 pages on just like what you can do with firewalls to help avoid these situations. And then intrusion detection, prevention, make sure you're applying updates, and then privacy control. So not everybody's going to have access to all the data that's coming through on these SCADA systems. And then this is a checklist by the Department of Homeland Security. If you guys do want to go to the site, just hover over this DHS checklist and you can click on it. I'll take you directly to it. Each of these checklists are slightly modified for each organization. So like I said, it just depends on what their area of focus is and what they determine to be the biggest risk and what they're trying to avoid. So. And then for the summary, ICS and SCADA systems are extremely important to our economy, day-to-day lives, and safety. These systems are vulnerable to cyber threats due to the incorporation of IT systems. So back in the day, these systems were pretty much just local area networks, had no outside connection to anything. So they were virtually safe from any kind of remote or cyber threats. Now, obviously, as technology advances and gets cheaper, a lot of these systems are starting to incorporate other components of IT systems, and a lot of the cybersecurity prevention methods that we have for these systems can work for SCADA and ICS systems, but they're a lot more proprietary, and also they need to be tailored. So they don't work directly in all cases, because sometimes, you know, they might affect the ability for these systems to stay up and running. Like one of the examples would be applying updates. I mean, sometimes you got to restart your computer to make sure the updates go through. You can't really do that if something's controlling, you know, water or electricity, because everyone would go crazy if they had neither of those, even if it was for like an hour. Also, it incorporates all these, it tries to incorporate all the methods, but like I said, they just don't translate efficiently. And these are the references. So I pretty much read this whole document, I read the whole publication. It's about 200 pages. And then these are the links that I kind of focused on. Fortinet had a lot of good videos kind of breaking down what ICS and SCADA solutions were, and also what are some security solutions. And that is it. Does anyone have any questions?
Anyone has any questions? Do you think what happened in Die Hard 4 could have been avoided if we had followed these standards?
Yes, definitely. And also in Skyfall.
Yeah.
So those are like pretty like extreme situations, and also with these systems being interconnected with us, I mean, they make a really good movie plot because everyone would freak out and cause a lot of damage.
That's true. Okay, let's move on. Next one is Joe.
Just give me 1 minute while I get the slides ready.
Let's go, Joe.
Okay, you guys can see everything fine, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, my name is Safar Rahim. I'm going to be giving a presentation about NIST standard, specifically the RMF framework, which is the risk management framework. Another part of this presentation that I'm supposed to be giving is a substandard that's part of the RMF. It's the SP 800-30. But as I go over the RMF, you guys will kind of get a better understanding of why I waited to go over that. So the presentation, you guys already know the format. I'm going to give a brief overview, kind of give you guys an idea of why this RMF is important. I'm going to give you guys some examples of who uses it. I couldn't really come up with any industry cases, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. I got some information from the publications for the checklist and kind of like how the assessment should be conducted. And then I'll kind of cover lessons learned, what I gained out of this, and kind of the skills that I had to accrue as I research this topic. So the NIST stands for National Institute of Standards and Technology. Essentially, I believe it was created in 1901. It's a government agency that kind of sets. They don't necessarily set regulations or anything, but they pretty much create standards for government agencies to comply with. As I go through the presentation, these standards are actually based on something called FISMA, and when I get more into the RMF, the framework, I'll cover what FISMA is. But just keep that in mind that the FISMA was an act that passed in 2002, and essentially just says that if you're a government agency, you have to handle data and you have to keep information security in sight because of the economic value it has. So what does the NIST do? They, like I said, they create standards. They have one of the oldest physical laboratories in the nation. Anything that relates to technology, measurement, they analyze it and they make sure that it's up to code. And what I mean by that is, as I go over the framework, we'll get into more details about that. But it was also created because during the 1900s, we were second rate compared to countries such as Germany, Spain, our economic rivals at the time. And we didn't really understand, the importance of having standards. And a commonality that you're going to see throughout this presentation with standards, obviously a great thing about them is that they standardize a lot of things. The terminology, the definitions, the way that people run certain things, it creates a way for everyone to use the same terminology, the same vocabulary, essentially. And it also bridges that gap between, which we already have experience with this, but it bridges that gap between kind of relaying cybersecurity information to, business leaders. So this kind of helps with that issue. So what is the risk management framework? the risk management framework is something that was created by NIST, you know, and I'll refer to as RMF from now on. Specifically, so it's just, think of it as a set of criteria. All it is just a set, just a bunch of criteria from a bunch of different documents. There is one primary document for this framework. It's called the SP 837. This is the primary document that actually defines what the risk management framework is. And just a general description of what the RMF is. The risk management framework provides a process that integrates security and risk management activities into the system development lifecycle. So essentially what this is for government agencies that are handling, you know, information, they need to follow, if they follow this framework, it will, not only will it comply with that FESMA Act from 2002, because all of these NIST standards do comply with federal regulations, but it also will, what was I going to say? I mean, it just makes them more, not professional, but more impervious to attacks, I guess I would say. They have a better understanding of what their attack surface is going to be. They have a better understanding. And not only that, it doesn't really matter, you know, as Danielle, I think, said earlier, not everyone is the same, you know, and this RMF actually dictates different standards for different agencies. So like you might have one set of standards for, you know, I'm not a government person, but, you know, like, I don't know who runs DHS and NSA, they might have a different set of standards compared to, you know, the VA or something. So the RMF under the SP 837, what you guys should know is that there's 6 steps. There's actually 7 steps, but the initial step is like a pre-step. It's called preparation, which obviously is what it sounds like. You just prepare for the assessment, not the assessment. Yeah, I guess it would be the assessment. But the 6 steps are categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, and monitor. So for the categorize step, this is kind of where you kind of start to realize what's going to have the most impact on your business. Okay. As you start to figure out what kind of information or what kind of, you know, what you guys are handling, what's the most valuable or what's the most critical, this is where you kind of start categorizing, you know, like, do you have usernames and passwords? Okay, that's kind of, you know, valuable information versus, you know, I don't know, you know, what their likes and dislikes are, I guess. So the select step is going to be where you're going to want to start picking out what kind of security measures you want to start to implement. This is where you start picking out the controls that you want to implement. And this is where you kind of tailor the RMF to your business, or I'm sorry, your agency, I guess I should say. The implementation is obviously going to be how everything from the select phase is going to be deployed, just depending on what those things are. The assessment step, this is where you kind of start to measure and determine how the controls were implemented correctly. And are they operating as intended? You know, did you implement, you know, I don't know, RFIDs, you know, to keep people out, but are people still getting in? I don't know, you know, like you just kind of review what you've implemented and kind of see, is it working or is it not working? You know, is it improving? And I guess that's, you know, just finding that out is going to vary depending on the organization. The authorized step, I'm sure this has something to do with the decisions and operations, and monitor is just go ahead and just having that, you know, that monitoring in place, just making sure that everything you have implemented is, you know, recorded, can be used, you know, for evidence later on. And like I said, all of this, you know, this is just packed into, you know, that NIST SP 837, which is the primary document for the RMF. There are a bunch of other documents. They're called supplementary documents, specifically the SP. They're all SP 800s, but the dash, they end in 30. So there's a 30, which I'm going to actually be covering during this presentation. And the others are 53, 53 alpha, and 137. So all these documents combined actually create what the RMF is, the risk management framework. And this, what's great about the RMF is that it not only works for new systems, it also works for legacy systems as well, which is an issue that we run into with government systems. So I kind of explained what RMF is and how the 837 is kind of the primary document for RMF. Now, this is one of the supplementary documents, this is the 830. This is actually a guide for conducting risk assessments. So the RMF was kind of just a general outline describing, what RMF was, risk management, all that stuff. So just a general outline for it. These kind of get into the different aspects of it. So this publication actually gives you guidance on how to conduct a risk assessment. You go through it. It helps you identify, what's at risk. So right here, you guys can read that general definition about what what value it brings. And like I said earlier, the terminology inside of this publication bridge the gap between us and the guys who work above us or who are managing the company. And it also helps standardize a lot of the vocabulary that people use because different industries, different teams, different regions use different terms for different meanings. So this kind of helps create a system where everyone uses the same terms and pretty much everything. They share everything. This is similar to another, I forgot what publication this comes, I think it is from the 837, but this follows a 3-step process. It's actually a 4-step process. I think one of them is assess, but essentially you're gonna prepare the assessment, you're gonna conduct the assessment, and then you're also gonna maintain the assessment. And all of those are exactly what it sounds like. You're gonna prepare for the assessment by getting information, going through the publication, assessing what your needs specifically are, and especially for what you deem critical, because there's 3 tiers for the publication. So you go through it and you conduct the assessment. So that's where you implement the assessment. And then after that, you kind of just go through and kind of do like maintenance. It's not necessarily what the conduct step was, but it's more you're just kind of maintaining what you had conducted and just keeping it going essentially. So the importance of these publications is that they promote innovation and industrial competitiveness by advancing measurement, science, standards, and technology in ways that enhance economic security and improve our quality of life. Like I said, these standards, they were created initially because our economic system was second rate compared to those other countries that I had mentioned earlier. So by creating the NIST and having these standards in place, it makes sure that our system, our infrastructure for businesses, or how they maintain information is competitive, and especially with our rivals. And when I say rival, I don't mean like our enemies or anything, but people who are at the same level that we are as far as economy goes. So, and also, like I said, it standardized a lot of that terminology and just bridges that gap between the cybersecurity people, the technical personnel, and relaying that information to the upper level executives. So I was trying to come up with some examples of who would be using this, and obviously this framework was written for DoD agencies. It was written for government agencies to utilize, and different publications are going to be tailored to different types of agencies. But I just threw this in here. I'm also assuming that if you're going to be like subcontracting for the, one of these government agencies, you're also going to have to be ensure that you're like NIST compliant, so that you're in regulation. I'm sure that has to be a thing. But yeah, so pretty much anybody working for the government or contracting for the government is going to want to use the RMF framework, and specifically if they want to run a risk assessment, they're going to want to use the SP 830. So for checklists, I couldn't really find a checklist, but I guess what I really want to show here is kind of what's going on. Like, it's not a checklist, but it's kind of like a steps. So I had gone over the steps earlier. You can see prepare in the beginning there. And then from there, you go from categorize, select, implement, and so on. And then over on the right side, you can see SP 830. which is one of the documents for which was the conduct a risk assessment. And you can see on their FIPS, I forgot what FIPS stand for, Federal Information Process System or Security or something. It's just the way that it was a regulation act, I think. I don't know what the 53 is, but this kind of just gives you an idea of what, if you were in the categorized system, you should be looking at, the SP 818, or, as you teeter through this, these steps, kind of gives you an idea of what you should be using at what phase. So that's the checklist for the RMF. So this is the general, what if you're working for the government, subcontracting, whatever, this is what you want to kind of follow generally. This is actually a specific from this is the very last page of the SP 830 documentation. And I don't want to say this is a checklist either. This is kind of just like, kind of steps, general steps that you can take to run your risk assessment. So here, they say they prepare, conduct, and maintain. I changed the slides there real quick, but so there is a fourth one in here where it says communicate and share, but they all follow. They share that commonality where we prepare for something, we conduct the assessment, and then we maintain the assessment. And then you can just read through some of these and kind of get a general idea. None of these are very specific. Again, these are things that you're gonna have to apply to your industry, to your whatever you're working with, and apply it to just kind of make it fit to what you're working with. And lessons learned. A lot of this seemed to revolve around FISMA, which was that Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002. And like I said, it had recognized the importance of information security to our economic and national security. Some commonalities I noticed as I was researching RMF and the publications. They identify, protect, and monitor. There's always that initial phase, the implementation kind of, and that just monitor, maintenance, maintain. And a cool thing that I learned as I was reading through some of the documentation was like the risk kind of. This is a general equation. I had a different one up here, but I wanted to keep it very simple. But the likelihood times the impact. So what's the chances of something happening times, what the impact would be. So if you have a bunch of like 1,000 usernames, actually let's say like a couple 100,000 usernames and passwords, and each of those are worth so and so much, you got to multiply the chances of those actually being leaked out times how much each of those are worth. And then you kind of get an idea of what the risk is for that data leakage, or if that data was ever exposed or hacked. The end. Questions?
Yeah, so suppose we have an organization with say 50 employees and we are like developing some Android applications for gaming. So should we be implementing these risk management frameworks within our organization?
So these this framework was specifically, these were written for government agencies, but they're not keeping, it wouldn't keep you from utilizing them yourself as a company and applying them to your company. So yes, you could use them. You don't need to follow them unless the work that you were doing was actually, you were creating a game or a simulator for, the Marine Corps or something. But you would just, you would be following it with the hopes that by following it, you're protecting your critical information systems, but you're not doing it in order to meet any requirements or anything like that.
Okay. Okay, if no more questions, then we'll move to Karisa.
Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. It's still good, right? I just put it in full screen. Cool. Okay. Okay, so my presentation is going to be on ISO 27001 standards. So what is ISO 27001? It's an international standard for information security management systems, also known as an ISMS. An ISMS is a framework of policies and procedures that include all legal, physical, and technical controls involved in an organization's information risk management processes. So ISO 27001 was published in October 2005. The ISO and the IEC, which is International Electrotechnical Commission, have developed the ISO 27001 to provide guidance for organizations to comply with laws, including the GDPR and the NIS regulations. So ISO specifies the requirements for and provides guidance for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving a PIMS, the Privacy Information Management System. The PIMS standard provides extensions and guidance on how to update the ISMS to also adequately include the management of privacy information. So ISO 27001 needs risk evaluations based on levels of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We're all pretty familiar with the CIA triad, so I won't go into it with detail, but that's the focus of the ISO 27001. So ISO uses a top-down risk-based approach and is technology neutral. So top-down means you divide the system into subsystems. So every first level subsystem will have more authority than its next level subsystem. Top-down is also backward-looking, which means it relies on historical data. This works because top-level managers will assign goals, procedures, and processes, as well as have expected outcomes. It has clear planning and management and involves a formal strategy for developing the lifetime of the system. A risk-based approach recognizes that risks do not fit into categories of either high or low, but instead they exist on a spectrum ranging from some risks which an organization will accept with little to no adverse impact to those risks which are severe enough to be avoided at all costs. The specification includes details for documentation, management, responsibility, internal audits, continual improvement, and corrective and preventive action. The standard requires cooperation among all sections of an organization. So next I'll cover the planning and decision-making processes associated with ISO 27001, implementation including associated costs, projected length, and implementation steps. So implementation costs are driven by perception of risk and how much risk an organization is prepared to accept. 4 costs need to be considered when implementing this type of project. One, you're going to have internal resources such as management, HR, IT. You'll have external resources like consultants. You'll have certification costs and implementation costs, which deal with the current health of the IT within the organization. On average, implementation can take 4 to 9 months, but it depends largely on the standard of conduct, quality management, size of the organization, and health of IT within the organization. So ISO 27001 and its supporting document, ISO 27002, there's a bunch of them, detail 133 security measures. Best practices are detailed on the slide, and they also include, to add to those, would be information security incident management, personnel security, security organization, communication and operations management, asset classification and control, and security policies. So the ISO 27001 certification, like other ISO management system certifications, usually involves a 3-stage audit process. Stage 1 is an informal review of the ISMS that includes checking the existence and completeness of key documents such as the organization's security policy, the risk treatment plan, the statement of applicability, and then stage 2 goes into independent tests of the ISMS against the requirements specified in the ISO 27001. Certification audits are usually conducted by ISO lead auditors. And then stage 3 is a follow-up, reviews or periodic audits to confirm that the organization remains in compliance with the standard. Certification maintenance requires periodic reassessment audits to confirm that the ISMS continues to operate as specified and intended. So the ISACA, Information Systems Audit and Control Association, takes the 6-step planning process I mentioned earlier and breaks it up into understandable and implementable phases. I will be covering these phases in detail based on the information they provide on their website. So phase 1 is identify business objectives. So stakeholders must buy in. Identifying and prioritizing objectives is a step that will gain management support. Primary objectives can be derived from the company mission, strategic plan, and IT goals. The objectives can be identification of information assets and effective risk management, preservation of the organization's reputation and standing among industry leaders, compliance with industry regulations, as well as the ones listed on the slide. Now, phase 2 is going to be obtain management support. You need management to make a commitment to the establishment, planning, implementation, operation, monitoring, review, maintenance, and improvement of the ISMS. You need assurance that the proper resources are available to work on the ISMS and that all employees affected by the ISMS have proper training, awareness, and competency. So along with the bullet points listed on the slide, examples of management support can also look like an announcement or communication to the organization about the importance of adhering to the information security policy, determination of the acceptable levels of risk, assurance that the personnel affected by the ISMS are provided with training, and then appointment of competent people for the roles and responsibilities that they are assigned to fulfill. Phase 3 is select the proper scope of implementation. So the ISO 27001 states that any scope of implementation may cover all or part of an organization. Only the processes, business units, and external vendors or contractors falling within the scope of implementation must be specified for certification to occur. So the standard also requires companies to list any scope exclusions and the reasons why they were excluded. You identify the scope of implementation. Identifying the scope of implementation can save the organization time and money. So some points that should be considered include the selection scope helps to achieve the identified business objectives. And then the organization's overall scale of operations is an integral parameter needed to determine the compliance processes complexity level. And then you need to ask questions like, will suppliers be required to abide by the ISMS? And then are there dependencies on other organizations, and should they also be considered? So basically the scope should be kept manageable, and it may be advisable to include only parts of the organization, such as the logical or physical grouping within the organization. Phase 4 is going to be define a method of risk assessment. So companies need to define and document a method or risk assessment. While ISO 27001 standard does not specify the risk assessment method to be used, the following points should be considered. The method to be used to assess the risk to identified information assets, which risks are intolerable and therefore need to be mitigated, managing the residual risks through carefully considered policies, procedures, and controls. Choosing a risk assessment method is one of the most important parts of establishing the ISMS. One of these things you can use, for this you can also use the NIST Special Publication 800-30. So lots of things you can use for this. Now for phase 5, prepare an inventory of information assets to protect and rank assets according to risk classification based on risk assessment. So the company needs to create a list of information assets to be protected. The risk associated with assets, along with the owner's location, criticality, and replacement value of assets should be identified. Some suggested steps will include, for assets, identify the CIA impact levels, whether it be high, medium, or low. Identify risks and classify them according to the severity and vulnerability. And then after identifying the risks and the levels of CIA, define values to the risks. And based on risk values, determine whether the risk is tolerable and whether to implement a control to eliminate or reduce the risk. The risk assessment methodology will guide in establishing risk levels for assets. So for phase 6, manage the risk and create a risk treatment plan. To control the impact associated with risk, the organization must accept, avoid, transfer, or reduce the risk to an acceptable level using risk mitigating controls. The next step is performing the gap analysis with the controls provided in the standard to create an RTP and an SOA. So the RTP is the risk treatment plan and the SOA is statement of applicability. It's important to obtain management approval of the proposed residual risks. So to go into the RTP a little bit more, it provides acceptable risk treatments, identification of operational controls and additional proposed controls with the help of gap analysis and a proposed control implementation schedule. So RTP provides a summary of each identified risk, the responses that have been designed to deal with that risk, the parties responsible for those risks, and the target date for applying the risk treatment. Dealing with risk doesn't necessarily mean eliminating it. Depending on the circumstances, you might be better off modifying the risk by applying security controls. Sharing the risk with a third party, whether it's insurer or another third party, or retaining the risk if you decide that's the likelihood or severity of the risk doesn't justify the cost of implementing the relevant controls. And then to go into SOA a little bit more, the statement of applicability. An SOA documents the relevance of each of ISO's 27001's controls to your organization. It should contain a list of controls that you will or won't implement, along with an explanation of why they have or haven't been selected. You only need to apply a control if it will mitigate a risk that you've identified. And then you should also state your level of progress in implementing the control. This could be a simple done or not done checkbox, or you could go into more detail explaining whether you have a plan or waiting for further guidance, have done work, or so on. Lastly, you must explain why any omitted controls were deemed irrelevant. Phase 7 is the set up policies and procedures to control risks. So for the controls adopted, as shown in the statement of availability, the organization will need statements of policy or detailed procedure and responsibility documents to identify user roles for consistent and effective implementation of policies and procedures. Documentation of policies and procedures is a requirement of ISO 27001. The list of policies and procedures depend on the organization's structure, locations, and assets. Phase 8 is allocate resources and train the staff. So the ISMS process highlights one of the important commitments for management: sufficient resources to manage, develop, maintain, and implement the ISMS. It's essential to document the training for audit. And then phase 9 is going to be monitor the implementation of the ISMS. The periodic internal audit is a must for monitoring and review. Internal audit review consists of testing of controls and identifying corrective preventive actions. To complete the PDCA cycle, which the gaps identified in the internal audit must be addressed by identifying the corrective and preventive controls needed and the company's compliance based on gap analysis. To be effective, the ISMS needs to be reviewed by management at periodic intervals. The review follows changes and improvements to policies, procedures, controls, and staffing decisions. This important step in the process is project management review. The results of audits and periodic reviews are documented and maintained. So phase 10 is prepare for the certification audit. In order for the organization to be certified, it is essential that it conduct a full cycle of internal audits, management reviews, and activities in the PDCA process, and that it retains evidence of the responses taken as a result of those reviews and audits. The ISMS management should review risk assessment, the RTP and SOA, and policies and procedures at least annually. The external auditor will first examine the ISMS documents to determine the scope and content of the ISMS. The objective of the review and audit is to have sufficient evidence and review audit documents sent to the auditor for review. The evidence and documents will demonstrate the efficiency and effectiveness of the implemented ISMS in the organization and its business units. Phase 11, periodic reassessment audits. So follow-up reviews confirm that the organization remains in compliance with the standard. Certification maintenance requires periodic reassessment audits to confirm that the ISMS continues to operate at as specified and intended. As with any other ISO standard, ISO 27001 follows the PDCA cycle, the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, and assists the ISMS management in knowing how far and how well the enterprise has progressed along this cycle. This also influences the time and cost estimates related to achieving compliance. So, why is ISO important, as well as conclusion? The success of ISO 27001 is shown with its alignment with business objectives and effectiveness in realizing those objectives. So IT and other departments play an important role in implementing ISO 27001. Implementing ISO is an exercise towards better understanding and existing inventory of IT initiatives, information availability, and ISMS implementation phases. An organization also needs to have the detailed understanding of PDCA implementation phases. So ISO 27001 requires a well-developed project plan, otherwise it would end up being very costly in time and money. To achieve the planned return on investment, the implementation plan has to be developed with an end goal in mind. Training and internal audit are major parts of ISO 27001 implementation. Certification should help assure most business partners of an organization's status with respect to information security without the necessity of actually having to conduct their own security reviews. And then these are some of the resources that I use. Most of them are blog articles and websites. I want to point out again, the ISACA website was really helpful in understanding all these best implemented parts of the ISO, how to best implement it, the certification, the auditing, everything. Also, I wanted to point out that the ISO certification is suitable for pretty much any size organization. Some examples I found online would be also specifically would be financial industry, telecoms, and government agencies. And that is it.
Okay, so the ISO 20001 standard, like, is it kind of a requirement by some of the industries? Like, suppose I am doing business with some financial institution, then they will have this kind of strict requirement that my company implements and gets certified with this ISO 27001.
Yeah, I don't believe it's actually a requirement from what I was looking at, but it is extremely helpful. Like it gives your investors security knowing that you are following those standards, and then too, if you get the certification, then you have that proof that you're up to par. So it's definitely highly suggested, but I don't believe that it's actually required, if I'm remembering right.
Okay. Then if no more questions, we'll move to Michael.
Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
All right. So let me share. You guys able to see everything? Hello?
We can see your screen.
Sounds good. So I'm going to talk about the incident response standards and the NIST 800-61. So I base my research basically on the Computer Security Incident Handling Guide. You can find it in here. It's like 79 to 80 pages. So basically from an individual as well as an organization and a nation computer security has been an essential component of our life. As like technology grows, the number of attacks will exponentially will grow and at the same speed. However, the question that we need to ask is, how are we preparing ourselves for an incident? Um, can we lower the number of incidents following a risk assessment? Of course, but this will not guarantee that all of the incidents can be prevented. Are we prepared for the incidents? Of course, that's why an incident response capability is necessary for a rapid detection, minimizing loss and destruction, mitigating the weaknesses and that were exploited, and then restoring the IT services. So what is a security incident? So it's a violation or imminent threat of a violation of a computer security policies or a standard security practices. For example, user click in an email and then attachment an executable malware, then this will maybe establish a connection with an external host. Another example would be the DOTS attack, which starts sending high volumes of connections to a server and then crush the system. Also, it could be an attacker that obtains data or private information, and then maybe he's just threatening the organization to release the data if he or she doesn't get some type of benefit. And then the another one could be a peer-to-peer, where usually a user install a software and then allow an external access to the internal servers. So a little bit of policy. Some policies are different and it will be depends on the organization needs. However, these are some of the key elements that as an organization, when creating the policies, need to look at it. So statement of management commitment, purpose and objective of the policy, the scope of the policy, definition of computer security incidents, definition of the roles, responsibilities, and levels of authority, prioritization and performance measurement, and reporting and contact forms. Also, with all of these, then you need to take the next step will be proceeding should be based on the incident response policy and plan. And then from there, you basically go for SOP, where it's being specified technical process, and then techniques, checklists, forms, and used by the incident response team. After an incident has occurred, the organization needs to communicate with outside parties, and it will be shared depending on the incidents, of course. Also, the incident response team needs to notify the organization, public office like CIO, head of information security, legal team, human resources, legal department, and management, and on other groups. So this is the process is the life cycle and then the process of incident response team. And here we will talk about the major phases of the incident response process. And so basically preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication and recovery, and post-incident activities. So we start with preparation. Focus on establishing an incident response team so the organization is ready for an incident and ensuring that the system, network, and application are secure. And then I divide this in basically two different like categories, where we have preparing, handling the incidents, and prevention. So if we go and look up handling the incidents, these are some of the tools and resources that we handle it that we can handle it. So for communication, we can have like contact information, on-call information, incident report and mechanisms, issue tracking system, smartphone, encryption software, secure storage facility. And then from hardware and software tools, we can have backup devices where we're able to preserve log files and save relevant data. Laptops to analyze data, sniffing packets, and write reports. Also, we can spare work list, server, and network equipment where we can restore backups and try our malware. We also we are able to bring some like portable printers that we can use to print logs and more evidence. Also, we can bring packet sniffing and protocols analyzing to analyze the network trafficking. We can also forensic software, which we are able to analyze the disk image, removable media to gather the evidence from the system, and then evidence gathering accessories to use to preserve the evidence and for a possible legal action. And then for prevention, the main idea is to keep the number of incidents low. Otherwise, this can overwhelm the incident response team and can have a negative impact on the business. These are some of the main recommendations for secure network, system, and application. So as a risk assessment, host security, network security, malware prevention, user awareness, and training. Then we go to the next phase, which is detection and analysis. This is very challenged to be able to identify every single attack and try to develop like step-by-step instruction to handle every incident. So it's very useful to be familiar with some of the possible attacks, such as external media. So infected, maybe a user or employee bring a USB flash drive and then it could infect the system. Brute force as well. And also another one could be a web, which is a script and an attacker write a script and then try to steal the credential and exploit the browser vulnerabilities. Also an email, an attack executed by an email message, impersonation, which is spoofing, man in the middle attack, in prose usage, which is a violation of the policies, and the loss or thief equipment. And then I broke this in three phases, which is incident analysis, incident documentation, and incident prioritization. For incident analysis, let's say that that the team believe that an incident has occurred, then they have to act rapidly and instantly the scope of the attack. They need to look at the networks, systems, or application, and maybe who, what, or where was originated. And some of the recommendations and make it a little easier will be like profile a network system, understand normal behavior, create a log retention policies, perform event correlation, keep all the host log synchronized, use internet search engines for search, run packet and sniffer to collect data and filter the data. Then for incident documentation, as soon as you maybe you start looking at you get in a tag and you have an incident, then you need to start recording with laptops, audio, and everything. And then having this information will help you to incident respond the team for future conversation and then be more efficient when handling problems. And also this can be presented in court for if they need to take legal actions. Then incident prioritization. This is the most important process when it's handling an incident. It should be handled as follows. So functional impact of the incident. So typically impact the business and it would result in a negative impact for all of the users. Information impact of the incident. So affect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the organization. And recovering from the incident, so affect will determine the amount of time and resources that the company organization must spend to recovering from the incident. Then the third phase will be containment, eradication, and recovery. And it was break in two parts, which is evidence gathering and handling, and then eradication and recovery. This is a very important step before the incident is unable to be major or increased damage. Also gives some time time to come with more strategies, and containment may vary depends on the type of incident. So if we go for evidence gathering and handling, identify information. The reason to gather evidence is to resolve the incident and also could be used on legal actions. So evidence information, for example, the location, serial number, model number, the host name, MAC address, IP address of a computer, name, title, and phone numbers of who collect the evidence, time and date for each occurrence and the evidence, and then location, of course, where the evidence is stored. And then eradication and recovery. Malware branches use an eradication step is incident response will determine what components need to be eliminated, such as malware, branch a user account, identify migration and vulnerabilities, and that they were affected. And then for recovery, we need to make sure the system and functionality normally. For example, we can just do clean backup, rebuilding system from scratch, replacing a system, changing password, trying the network. And for the last phase, which is post-incident activity, and this is the last one, and the team usually tend to skip this one, where the incident response team have the time and the opportunity to learn and improve from the previous events. And then it was break down in two parts, which is using collection in, incident data and then evidence retention. So for using collection incident data, the number of incidents handled, so take as a measurement of the amount of work the incident response team had to perform, measuring for time periods incidents, so measuring the total amount of labor spent working on a particular incident, the objective assessment in each incident, so determine how effective it was the response, and then subjective assessment for each incident, which is the team member asked to evaluate their selves and other members. And this is a good time to look yourself as a member of the incident response team. So make sure that if you're following the right guidelines. And for the evidence detention, so we have prosecution, which if it's possible, the attacker will be prosecuted. So the evidence need to be handled, and it could take up to 10, it depends on the organization, but it takes years to when the evidence need to be presented in court. Also data retention, which the data retention policies. So those are based on the organization. They may state how long the data may retain in the organization or hard drive or etc. And then cause original hardware like hard drive, compromised systems. And then this, basically this is a life cycle. So it goes back again, and then where you preparation, be ready for any incidents, detection and analysis, be familiar with methods of possible attacks, containment, eradication, and recovery, very important step. Eliminate and remove any threats. After that, make sure that everything is go back to normal. And post-incident activities, when are you, you have the time to take, to look yourself and your team and make sure you're doing the right thing. And that's pretty much it. So if you have any questions, you can ask me.
Yeah, so suppose your organization is hit by kind of data breach, then what would be your step-by-step incident response plan to handle that?
For a data breach, so first of all, you start need to look at where who or where the breach was encountered. So you need to see if it was maybe a user, or if it's one of your employees, or if it's maybe just something that is leaking out there. And then from there, you of course need to handle, depends of the situation and what the data was leaked. If it's an important data or confidential data, then you need to start involving the maybe some of the local officers, or like the right person, the person who's handling cybersecurity, and let them know that some of the data out there could be leaked, and it's very confidential data. And then also you need to talk to some of the user and let them know that unfortunately some of the data was leaked.
Okay, so what will be your media outreach strategy? Suppose you are a public company like Facebook and the the user information got leaked, like how soon you should make it public that, hey, we were breached, or is it part of the incident response framework at all?
Well, that would depend of the organization. Like I said, that could affect the business itself, because people is trusting these companies to publish many things out there, and so that's it depends of the organization and how they want to handle that approach. So that's why you need to talk to different like CIO or legal managers and all of these people before you take a decision on how to start telling the users out there that maybe your
Yeah,
data
I
was.
think there are also some federal or legal regulations that if you are a public company, that within 60 hours you have to inform everyone that we have been breached. So that is something that companies take into consideration in their incident response plan.
Gotcha.
Okay, finally, Shanna.
Okay, so my presentation is on PCI, which is also known as Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. PCI lists the requirements that secure and protect card processing, storage, handling, and transmissions. All businesses who handle card payments must follow this. It has guidelines that include 12 requirements that I grouped into 6 categories, and they are building and maintenance of a secure network and system, cardholder data protection, vulnerability management, access control, monitoring and testing of utilized networks, and policy documentation. There are 4 levels of compliance, and it depends on how large the business is. So a level 4 would be a business that processes the least amount of transactions, and 1 would be a business that processes the most. So a level 1 business would be a business that does more than 60 million transactions. The PCI is important because it secures business data and it protects clients. It also helps gain customer confidence because customers would be less likely to submit card information to businesses that are not secure. It provides a security standard, and it also helps businesses avoid fines and lawsuits, and it also helps businesses reduce costs because they would normally have to pay non-compliance fines if they are not in compliance with the PCI standard. The checklist for compliance, the first step is they have to determine their PCI level. So they need to know the number of transactions they process annually. They have to map the flow of the cardholder data. So they need to make sure they know everything about where it's going, all the data, and who handles it. They have to fill out a self-assessment questionnaire, which validates PCI compliance by checking the 12 requirements. They have to fill out an attestation of compliance, which ensures businesses fulfilled the requirements. They have to conduct a vulnerability scan, and they have to submit all the required documents, such as SAC and AOC. They also have to continuously monitor their systems and networks to make sure that they're continuously compliant. Some of the consequences for being non-compliant is the businesses would have to pay monthly penalties. They could suffer legal action, damaged reputation, revenue loss, and data breaches. Some examples of businesses that suffered data breaches are Home Depot. They had a data breach that compromised 56 million credit cards. Their point of sale systems had malware that allowed the attackers to steal credit and debit card information. Most of these systems were not assessed for vulnerabilities and were even off limits to their security staff. The second one is Office of Personnel Management. The attackers were able to get into OPM servers and steal personnel files of 4.2 million former and current government employees. There was a lack of oversight of two-factor authentication for employee access to sensitive information, which could have been avoided if, they had done more vulnerability testing and assessments, which PCI does require. And lastly, the TJX companies. Over 45 million credit card numbers were stolen due to their data breach. It was 80 gigabytes of card information and it was stolen over 18 months. And the company was not compliant in 9 of the 12 PCI requirements. Overall, the lessons learned that the 12 requirements are necessary to help a business stay secure. If a business like Home Depot didn't perform vulnerability scans or assess their systems, it can easily lead to a data breach. Being PCI compliant only helps prevent an attack, but it is not bulletproof. It is the responsibility of the business to make sure their networks and systems are secure from internal and external vulnerabilities. These are all the resources I used while researching this topic, and so that's pretty much it. Any questions?
Yeah, so basically, are there like certain levels of check in terms of PCI that are enforced on certain payment card industry organizations? So suppose like Visa is one of the payment card processing industry. So like, is it that they have to be fully PCI compliant, or there are different levels within the PCI compliance that can be achieved?
Yeah, so there's 4 different levels of PCI compliance, and it depends on the size, like basically the number of transactions that the businesses has. So level 4 would be a business that is, it doesn't have, it would be the least amount of transactions, and a level 1 business would be the most amount of transactions. So it depends on the number of transactions that a business has.
But a particular transaction amount can also, like, suppose there is one transaction worth like millions of dollars, as opposed to like 100 transactions for like $100 each. So is that taken into account while deciding these levels?
Yeah, so a level 1, it would be upwards of 6 million transactions, or a business that has actually experienced a breach. And level 4 would be less than 20,000 internet transactions or less than 1 million physical card transactions.
Oh, okay. And are there any like sanctions or fines that were imposed on certain industries that fail to meet these standards that you know of?
Yes, they do. They do monthly fine a business that is non-compliant, and it also depends on their PCI level. So it depends on how much, that also depends on how much transactions they have. So it can be between $5,000 a month to $100,000 a month.
Okay. And for the companies that use some kind of processing, and suppose there are certain vendors that are associated with, say, Google Pay, does Google expect them to have some kinds of PCI standards?
Yes, it would be any business that handles card information. So yes.
Okay. Any other questions, guys? If not, I think that's pretty much it for this meeting. So yeah, stay safe and just keep on improving your knowledge base, even if you are still searching for jobs. Just every day, iteratively keep on learning new stuff that is relevant to those industry positions. And yeah, we will connect again on via Zoom next week, same time. And thank you everyone for your presentation. Feedback wise, I think if I have to choose one presentation, I think I liked Dan's presentation quite a lot because he had like very specific examples and was kind of in depth. So when you